The massive crystalline throne room of the Zephyrian Empire stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction. Queen Vexithari sat upon her elevated seat, her 6 arms gracefully arranged while her serpentine lower body coiled beneath the ancient seat of power. Her scales shimmered with an iridescent purple that had intimidated countless species across 17 galaxies for over 3 centuries. Today was different. Today the unthinkable was happening. The great doors, carved from meteorite stone and standing 40 meters tall, slowly groaned open. Through them walked a delegation that should have been impossible. At the front strode a creature no taller than her forearm, bipedal and covered in strange fabric. Its skin was pale pink, almost translucent, and atop its head grew thin strands of brown fiber. The creature's eyes were small and round, colored a peculiar blue that seemed to shift in the light. A human. Behind the human walked representatives from a dozen other species, all of whom had been under Zephyrian rule for generations. The Korthak with their massive frames and stone-like skin, the ethereal Luminari whose bodies seemed made of living starlight, the insectoid Chitauri with their compound eyes reflecting the throne room's bioluminescent walls. All of them followed this tiny creature as if it held authority over them. Queen Vexithari's mind raced back to the reports that had been flooding in for the past year. A new species had emerged from a backwater spiral arm of the galaxy, claiming territory and forming alliances with unprecedented speed. The reports had been dismissed as exaggerations. How could such primitive beings pose any threat to an empire that had conquered star systems, when these humans were still learning to make fire? The human delegation stopped at the prescribed distance from the throne, exactly 50 meters as protocol demanded. But instead of the expected prostration, the small creature simply stood upright, its tiny eyes meeting her gaze directly. The audacity sent a ripple of electricity through her scales. "Your Imperial Majesty," the human spoke, its voice carrying clearly across the vast space through translation devices. "I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Federation. I come bearing terms for a peace accord between our peoples." Vexithari's 4 eyes narrowed. Peace accord, not surrender. Not tribute, peace. As if this creature considered itself an equal. "You stand in the presence of the sovereign of 17 galaxies, Empress of 1,000 worlds, she who commands the stars themselves," announced her prime minister, his voice booming with the proper reverence. "You will kneel." The human tilted its head slightly, an expression that somehow conveyed both respect and refusal. "With all due respect to Her Imperial Majesty, I represent a sovereign nation. I bow to no one save my own people." A collective gasp echoed through the throne room. Even Vexithari felt her breath catch. In 300 years of rule, no being had ever refused to kneel before her. The penalty for such insolence was traditionally immediate execution, but these were not traditional times. The reports had been disturbing enough. Entire Zephyrian fleets had simply vanished while approaching human territories. The few survivors spoke of weapons that defied understanding, of ships that moved faster than light in ways that broke every known law of physics. They described humans who fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, refusing to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Most troubling of all were the reports of human diplomacy. Somehow this young species had convinced dozens of races to join their cause. Species that had been loyal subjects of the Zephyrian Empire for generations were now flying human flags and fighting under human command. "You claim to offer peace," Vexithari said, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. "Yet your kind has been raiding our territories, destroying our fleets, and turning our subjects against us." Admiral Chen's expression remained calm. "Your Imperial Majesty, with respect, those territories contain enslaved populations. Those fleets were engaged in raids against civilian populations, and those subjects chose freedom over servitude." The words hit like physical blows. Enslaved, raids, servitude. How dare this creature reframe the natural order of things? The strong ruled the weak. That was the way of the universe. The Zephyrian Empire brought order to chaos, civilization to barbarism. "You speak of freedom as if it were a virtue," Vexithari replied, rising from her throne. Her full height of 8 meters cast a shadow over the human delegation. "Freedom is chaos. Order is peace. We have brought stability to countless worlds, and we've seen that stability." Chen responded without flinching. "Mass graves on Cornac Prime, forced labor camps on the Tritium moons, Children separated from their families to serve as hostages for their planet's cooperation. Your Imperial Majesty may call it order, but we call it genocide. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Vexathari felt her scales flush darker with rage. How dare this insignificant creature judge the policies of an empire that spanned galaxies? Every action had been necessary for the greater good, for the preservation of order across the cosmos. Yet even as anger coursed through her, a colder emotion began to take hold. Fear. The human stood there, tiny and fragile-looking, surrounded by former subjects of her empire who now looked to it for leadership. Behind Chen, she could see the Korthak delegation. The Korthak, whose world she had conquered personally 2 centuries ago, now stood as allies to humanity. The same species that had fought her fleets for 50 years before finally submitting now, willingly served under human command. How had this happened? How had a species that barely qualified as spacefaring managed to turn her own subjects against her? What exactly are you proposing? Vexathari asked, settling back onto her throne with as much dignity as she could maintain. Chen stepped forward, producing a small device that projected a holographic document into the air between them. Complete cessation of hostilities between the Terran Federation and the Zephyrian Empire. Withdrawal of all Zephyrian forces from disputed territories. Recognition of the independence of all worlds that have chosen to join the Federation, and the establishment of a joint commission to oversee the transition. The terms were outrageous. They essentially demanded that she give up half her empire. But what struck her even more was the final point. A joint commission? She inquired. Yes, Your Imperial Majesty. To be headed by myself with your appointment as co-chair. The words hit like a thunderbolt. Co-chair. Not chair. Not supreme authority. Equal status with this human creature. For the first time in 3 centuries, Queen Vexathari found herself speechless. The silence stretched across the throne room like a taut wire ready to snap. Queen Vexathari stared at the projection floating between her and the human admiral, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The document outlined not just a peace treaty, but a complete restructuring of the galactic order she had spent centuries building. You expect me to share authority with you? She said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Admiral Chen nodded calmly. The commission will oversee the transition of liberated worlds, ensure the safe relocation of populations who wish to leave Zephyrian space, and establish new trade agreements between our peoples. It requires leadership from both sides. Vexathari's 4 eyes studied the human with new intensity. There was something about this creature's demeanor that unsettled her beyond the obvious audacity. Chen showed no fear, no deference, but also no arrogance. She spoke as if the proposed arrangement was simply practical, reasonable even. And if I refuse? The Queen asked. Then the war continues, Chen replied without hesitation. And based on current trends, that would be unfortunate for both our peoples, but particularly for yours. The casual delivery of what amounted to a threat sent another ripple through Vexathari's scales. But before she could respond, her military advisor, General Kexmore, stepped forward from his position beside the throne. Your Imperial Majesty, perhaps we should examine their recent actions more closely, he said, his mechanical voice translator giving his words an ominous metallic ring. Vexathari gestured for him to continue, though she noticed Chen's expression didn't change. The human seemed genuinely curious about what would be said. 3 weeks ago, our 7th Fleet encountered human forces at the Paradigm system, Kexmore announced to the room. 47 heavy cruisers and 3 dreadnoughts against what appeared to be 12 human vessels. He paused, his insectoid features clicking with what Vexathari recognized as nervous energy. The entire fleet was disabled within 18 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Every ship was left intact but completely powerless, drifting in space with their crews unharmed but their weapons and engines completely non-functional. A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers. Vexathari felt her stomach clench. She had read the report, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of the human delegation made it somehow more real, more humiliating. Furthermore, Kexmore continued, before departing, the human vessels broadcast detailed repair instructions to our fleet commanders, along with star charts showing the quickest route back to Zephyrian space. This detail had been buried deep in the classified sections of the report. Vexathari shot a sharp look at her general, but the damage was done. She could see the implications registering on the faces of her court. The humans hadn't just defeated a superior force. They had done so while showing mercy to their enemies. Chen spoke into the silence that followed. The Terran Federation prefers to end conflicts without unnecessary loss of life. Your crews were brave and followed their orders. They didn't deserve to die for following commands from leaders who hadn't yet learned there was a better way. The statement was clearly directed at Vexithari herself, though delivered with diplomatic courtesy, yet it was the human's next words that truly shook her. Your Imperial Majesty, we know about the Nexus Core. Every eye in the room turned to stare at the human admiral. The Nexus Core was the most closely guarded secret of the Zephyrian Empire, known only to the Queen herself and her most trusted advisors. It was the source of her power, the ancient artifact that allowed her consciousness to span multiple galaxies and coordinate her vast empire. How could these newcomers possibly know about it? Impossible, Vexithari said, though her voice betrayed her shock. Chen reached into her uniform and withdrew a small crystalline device. Even from 50 meters away, Vexithari could sense its energy signature. It was definitely connected to Nexus technology, but somehow different, refined. We call it a neural network interface, Chen explained. Our scientists developed it after studying similar technology we discovered on abandoned worlds in our expansion. We believe your Nexus Core operates on the same principles but with significant limitations. Vexithari felt the blood drain from her face. The Nexus Core wasn't just her greatest secret. It was her greatest weakness. The device that gave her empire-spanning consciousness also bound her to her throne room. She couldn't leave this chamber for more than a few hours without losing her connection to her far-flung territories. It was why she ruled through representatives, why she hadn't personally led a military campaign in over a century. Our version allows for mobility, Chen continued conversationally. Range isn't limited by physical proximity to a base station. We thought you might be interested in comparing technologies. The offer was clearly more than scientific curiosity. It was a demonstration of capability, a show of just how far ahead human technology had advanced. They weren't just offering to share authority. They were offering to share power itself. But it was also something else. Hope. For 2 centuries, Vexithari had been effectively imprisoned by her own power. The Nexus Core gave her the ability to rule 17 galaxies, but at the cost of her freedom. She had watched from her throne as the universe changed around her, always connected but never truly present. Why? She asked, the question coming out more vulnerable than she intended. Why offer this? Chen's expression softened slightly. Because ruling shouldn't be a prison sentence, Your Imperial Majesty. And because the galaxy is changing, new threats are emerging from the void between galaxies, dangers that will require all of our peoples working together to face. This was news to Vexithari. Her intelligence networks had detected strange energy signatures at the galactic rim, but the reports had been inconclusive. What kind of threats? She demanded. Something that makes our territorial disputes look like children's games, Chen replied grimly. We've lost 3 exploration fleets too. Entities that seem to exist partially outside normal space-time. They consume energy on a scale that could drain entire star systems. The human admiral gestured to her delegation, and Vexithari noticed for the first time that it included representatives from species she didn't recognize. Beings with technology that looked impossibly advanced even by Zephyrian standards. The Terran Federation isn't just an alliance of the species in our local cluster, Chen explained. We've been making contact with civilizations from the galactic core, from other galaxies entirely. All of them are preparing for the same threat. Vexithari's mind raced. If this was true, if there really were external threats of this magnitude, then her empire's greatest enemy might not be humanity at all. It might be something far worse, something that would require unprecedented cooperation to defeat. You're proposing an alliance, she said slowly. I'm proposing survival, Chen corrected. The peace accord is just the first step. What we really need is integration, shared technology, combined fleets, coordinated defense networks spanning multiple galaxies. The human leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes fixed on Vexithari's face. Your Imperial Majesty, we've studied your empire's history. You've held 17 galaxies together for 3 centuries through force and fear. We're offering you the chance to hold 17 galaxies together through cooperation and mutual benefit. Which do you think would be stronger when the real test comes? The weight of Admiral Chen's words settled over the throne room like a heavy blanket. Queen Vexthari found herself studying the human with entirely new eyes. This wasn't just about territorial disputes or even political power. This was about survival on a scale she had never imagined. "You speak of threats from beyond our galaxy," she said carefully. "Show me." Chen nodded to one of the unfamiliar beings in her delegation, a creature that seemed to be made of living metal with surfaces that reflected light in impossible ways. The being stepped forward and activated a device that projected a three-dimensional map of the local galactic cluster. "This is the hegemony of assembled minds," the metallic being spoke, its voice somehow emanating from the air around it rather than from any visible mouth. "We are what you might call refugees from the Andromeda galaxy." The map zoomed in to show Andromeda, but instead of the spiral galaxy that should have been there, the projection showed a twisted, darkened mass shot through with veins of sickly light. "The Devourers arrived in our galaxy approximately 50 of your years ago," the being continued. "They do not conquer. They do not enslave. They simply consume. Matter, energy, even the quantum foam that underlies reality itself. They leave nothing behind but empty space." Vexathari felt her scales shift to a deep purple, the color that indicated profound unease among her people. "How many survived?" "Of 300 billion souls across 47,000 star systems, perhaps 10,000 of us managed to escape to your galaxy," the being replied, with what sounded like infinite sadness. "The rest are gone. Not dead. Gone. As if they never existed." The projection shifted to show tracking data of energy signatures moving through intergalactic space. The patterns were unlike anything in Vexthari's extensive databases of known phenomena. "Our long-range sensors detect similar signatures approaching from multiple directions," Chen added. "We estimate first contact in 18 months, possibly sooner. When they arrive, territorial boundaries won't matter. Species distinctions won't matter. The only thing that will matter is whether we can mount a coordinated defense." Vexthari's mind raced through the implications. Her empire's military doctrine had been built around suppressing individual worlds and species, not defending against external existential threats. Her fleets were designed for occupation, not the kind of desperate total war that Chen was describing. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Chen gestured and a new hologram appeared, showing fleet formations and defensive networks spanning multiple galaxies. "Integration of all available military assets under unified command. Sharing of all technological resources, evacuation protocols for civilian populations, and most importantly, development of new weapons technologies that might actually be effective against the Devourers." The human paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "Your Imperial Majesty, I won't lie to you. The defensive preparations we're planning will require sacrifices from everyone involved. Resources that could be used for expansion or luxury will have to be redirected to weapons research and fortress construction. Some systems may have to be evacuated entirely to create strategic buffers." Vexathari studied the projected defensive plans with growing alarm. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. It would require not just cooperation between her empire and the Human Federation, but complete restructuring of both civilizations around a single goal. "And you believe this unified command should be shared between us?" "Not just between us," Chen corrected. "The hegemony of assembled minds brings computational power beyond anything either of our species can match. The ethereal collective from the galactic core has mastered dimensional manipulation. The Forge Worlds have manufacturing capabilities that dwarf both our empires combined. What we're proposing is a true galactic confederation, with leadership distributed based on each civilization's strengths." A new voice spoke from among the delegation. Vexathari turned to see one of her own former subjects, a Korthak whose stone-like features she remembered from reports of the rebellion on their homeworld. "Your Imperial Majesty," the Korthak said, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "I am General Thoknar of the Korthak Liberation Forces. I fought against your rule for 20 years before the humans arrived. I would have died fighting your forces if necessary." Vexthari bristled, but the Korthak continued before she could respond. "But I have seen what the humans showed us. Recordings from refugee ships, sensor data from the edge of the galaxy. Your Imperial Majesty, if the Devourers come, there will be no Korthak worlds to liberate. There will be no Zephyrian Empire to rebel against. There will be nothing at all." The Korthak stepped closer, his massive frame dwarfing even Vexathari's impressive height. "I request permission to return to Zephyrian service. under the new joint command structure, not as a conquered subject but as an equal partner in defense of our galaxy. The request hit Vexithari like a physical blow. This creature had been her enemy, had cost her fleets and resources in countless battles. Yet here he was, asking to serve alongside her against a greater threat. She looked around the room, seeing her courtiers' faces reflecting the same confusion and uncertainty she felt. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for was being challenged not by conquest but by obsolescence. "Admiral Chen," she said finally, "if I agree to this confederation, what guarantee do I have that humanity won't simply absorb my empire once the external threat is dealt with?" Chen's response was immediate and direct. "Because we don't want your empire, your Imperial Majesty. We want your partnership. The challenges we'll face in the coming centuries will require every bit of wisdom, experience, and capability that both our civilizations can bring to bear." The human gestured to the projected defensive plans again. "Look at these force distributions. We're not talking about human fleets with Zephyrian auxiliaries, or Zephyrian fleets with human advisors. We're talking about integrated commands where a human admiral might serve under a Zephyrian strategic commander, or where Zephyrian technology is improved by human innovation and vice versa." Chen paused, her expression becoming more personal. "Your Imperial Majesty, I've studied the history of your empire. 300 years ago, you unified dozens of warring species under a single banner. You brought peace to regions that had known nothing but conflict for millennia. Yes, some of your methods were harsh, but the fundamental achievement was remarkable." The human's words carried genuine respect, not the careful flattery Vexithari was used to from diplomats. "What we're asking you to do now is essentially the same thing, but on a galactic scale, and through cooperation rather than conquest. Use those same organizational skills, that same strategic vision, but in partnership with others who bring different strengths to the table." Vexithari felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: genuine uncertainty. For 3 centuries, every major decision had been hers alone to make. Now she was being asked to share that responsibility, to trust others with the fate of her people. But the alternative, if Chen was telling the truth about the external threat, was the complete annihilation of everything she had built. "I will need to consult with my advisors," she said finally. "Of course," Chen replied. "But your Imperial Majesty, we don't have unlimited time. Our intelligence suggests the first of our scouts could arrive within months, not years. Every day we delay integration is a day we lose in preparation." The human admiral bowed slightly, a gesture of respect rather than submission. "We'll remain in orbit for 72 hours awaiting your decision. After that, we'll need to continue preparations with whatever allies we have." As the delegation turned to leave, Vexithari felt the weight of perhaps the most important decision in galactic history settling on her shoulders. The great doors closed behind the human delegation with a resonating boom that seemed to echo through Vexithari's very bones. For long moments the throne room remained silent except for the distant hum of the bioluminescent walls. Then, like a dam bursting, voices erupted from every corner of the chamber. "Preposterous!" shouted Minister Velkoth, his crystalline features flashing with indignation. "To suggest that we share command with primitives who learned space travel mere centuries ago." "Did you see their technology demonstrations?" countered Admiral Zexavara, her tentacles writhing with nervous energy. "Those weren't primitive weapons that disabled our 7th Fleet." Queen Vexithari raised one of her forearms, and the arguing voices fell silent. She had ruled for 3 centuries by maintaining absolute authority, but now she found herself genuinely uncertain. The discussion that followed would shape not just her empire, but possibly the fate of the entire galaxy. "General Kexmore," she said, turning to her military advisor, "give me your honest assessment of our capabilities against these devourers." The insectoid general's features clicked nervously. "Your Imperial Majesty, based on the data provided by the refugees, our conventional weapons would be completely ineffective. Plasma cannons, kinetic bombardment, even our quantum disruption torpedoes operate by manipulating matter and energy. Against entities that consume matter and energy as sustenance." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. "What about our Nexus core technology?" asked Minister Velkoth. "Surely our psychic warfare capabilities would be effective." The hegemony refugees' warning echoed in Vexithari's mind. The devourers didn't just consume matter and energy. They consumed the quantum foam underlying reality itself. If they could affect the fundamental structure of space-time, psychic attacks might be equally useless. There's another consideration, Admiral Zexvara said quietly. The human admiral was correct about one thing. Our empire is held together by fear and overwhelming force. If we appear weak, if our subjects believe we cannot protect them, and she didn't need to finish. Vexathari had seen the rebellion spreading through her outer territories over the past year. Species that had been loyal for generations were suddenly questioning her authority, inspired by humanity's message of freedom and self-determination. Your Imperial Majesty, a new voice spoke from the back of the chamber. Vexathari turned to see Science Minister Thylek approaching the throne, her biomechanical augmentations whirring softly. I've been analyzing the technological samples the human delegation provided. The neural network interface they mentioned. It's not just an improvement over our Nexus core. It's a complete paradigm shift. The minister activated a holographic display showing complex energy patterns. Our Nexus core operates by brute force, overwhelming local quantum fields to establish psychic connections across vast distances. It works, but it requires enormous energy expenditure and binds the user to a fixed location. The human technology works with quantum fields rather than against them, creating self-sustaining networks that actually become more efficient as they grow larger. Vexathari felt her scales shift to a pale yellow, the color of deep thought among her people. Are you saying their technology is superior? I'm saying their technology is centuries ahead of ours in specific areas, while ours is centuries ahead of theirs in others, Thylek replied. But more importantly, their approach suggests a fundamental difference in philosophy. They build systems designed to be shared and expanded. We build systems designed to be controlled by a single entity. The implications of that observation settled over the room like a cold wind. Everything about Zephyrian technology was designed around centralized control, around ensuring that power flowed from the periphery to the center. Human technology seemed designed to distribute power outward, to strengthen the whole by empowering the parts. There's something else, Thylek continued. I've been monitoring quantum fluctuations at the galactic rim for the past several months. The patterns match what the refugees described. Something is definitely approaching our galaxy, and it's larger than anything we've ever encountered. Minister Velkoth stepped forward, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns. Even if the threat is real, surely we can face it without surrendering our sovereignty to a coalition of former rebels and alien species. Can we? Vexathari asked pointedly. General Kexmore, how many loyal fleets do we currently have? The question clearly made the military commander uncomfortable. Active and reliable? Perhaps 60% of our total forces. The others are either engaged in suppression operations or of questionable loyalty. And our production capacity? Reduced by approximately 40% due to rebellions and work slowdowns on key industrial worlds. Vexathari felt the weight of those numbers settling in her stomach like cold stone. Her empire was already stretched to its breaking point trying to maintain order. Adding an external existential threat to the equation would likely collapse her entire power structure. But there was another factor to consider, one that had been nagging at her since the human delegation departed. Admiral Chen made an interesting point about our expansion, she said slowly. For 3 centuries we've been adding new territories and new subjects, but have we actually grown stronger? The question seemed to surprise her advisors. Admiral Zexvara's tentacles stilled as she considered it. What do you mean, Your Imperial Majesty? I mean, when we conquered the Korthak homeworld 2 centuries ago, we gained access to their mining technology and their warrior culture. But instead of integrating those advantages, we suppressed them. We turned skilled miners into forced laborers and proud warriors into reluctant garrison troops. Vexathari rose from her throne, her serpentine lower body uncoiling as she began to pace in the limited space available to her. We've been collecting species like trophies rather than partners. Imagine if instead of suppressing Korthak mining expertise, we had integrated it with our own technology. Imagine if we had trained Chitauri engineers alongside our own, rather than using them as manual laborers. Science Minister Thylek's augmentations whirred with increased activity. Your Imperial Majesty, are you suggesting that our imperial model is flawed? The question hung in the air like a dangerous chemical. To question the imperial model was to question 3 centuries of Zephyrian expansion, 3 centuries of Vexathari's own rule. but looking at the technological innovations the humans had achieved through cooperation, looking at the loyalty they had inspired among former Zephyrian subjects, it was hard to deny that their approach had produced remarkable results. "I'm suggesting," Vexthari said carefully, "that our current model may be inadequate for the challenges we're facing." She turned to face her assembled advisors, her four eyes taking in each of their expressions. "The humans didn't defeat our fleets through superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. They defeated us through superior cooperation. Every species in their federation contributes its unique strengths to their common defense. When they encountered our forces, they weren't facing just human ships. They were facing vessels designed with Korthak engineering, crewed by Chitauri navigators, and equipped with weapons developed through pooled research from dozens of different scientific traditions. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. For 3 centuries, Vexithari had believed that diversity was a weakness to be suppressed, that unity could only be achieved through uniformity. The humans had proven that diversity could be a source of strength if properly channeled. "Your Imperial Majesty," Minister Velkoth said quietly, "if we agree to this confederation, what becomes of our empire? What becomes of you?" It was the question Vexithari had been avoiding, the one that struck at the heart of her deepest fears. For 3 centuries, she had been the absolute sovereign of 17 galaxies. Her word was law, her will was destiny. To share that authority, to become merely one voice among many, felt like death itself. But as she looked around the throne room, at the advisors whose loyalty was increasingly questionable, at the reports of rebellion spreading across her territories, at the evidence of an external threat that could destroy everything she had built, another possibility began to take shape. Perhaps true strength wasn't about controlling everything. Perhaps it was about building something strong enough to survive even without her direct control. "Summon Admiral Chen," she said finally. "Tell her I wish to discuss the specific terms of this confederation in greater detail." Admiral Chen returned to the throne room within hours, but this time she came alone. The absence of the larger delegation made the encounter feel more personal, less like a formal state negotiation and more like a conversation between 2 leaders trying to solve an impossible problem. Vexithari had spent those hours studying the detailed reports her intelligence services had compiled on humanity over the past year. What she had discovered challenged everything she thought she knew about power and governance. "Admiral," she said as Chen approached the throne, "I've been reviewing your species' history. You've only achieved interstellar travel within the last few centuries, yet you've managed to build an alliance spanning dozens of star systems. How?" Chen's expression showed a mixture of surprise and respect at the directness of the question. "Your Imperial Majesty, humans have a saying, unity through diversity. We learned early in our spacefaring era that different perspectives solve different problems. When we encountered the Korthak rebels fleeing your empire, we didn't see potential subjects. We saw potential teachers," the human gestured, and a small holographic display appeared between them, showing technical schematics. Korthak deep-core mining techniques allowed us to establish bases on worlds we previously thought uninhabitable. In return, our medical technology helped them overcome genetic damage from centuries of forced exposure to radioactive materials. In your labor camps, Vexithari felt her scales flush with shame at the reminder of her empire's treatment of conquered peoples. But Chen continued without judgment. "When the Chitauri joined us, their navigation instincts helped us map safe hyperspace routes through regions we'd never dared explore. Our agricultural technology helped them restore ecosystems on worlds that had been strip-mined for resources." The pattern was clear. Each species brought unique strengths, and the Federation found ways to combine those strengths rather than suppress them. "But how do you maintain order?" Vexithari asked. "How do you prevent chaos when everyone has a voice?" Chen smiled slightly. "The same way you maintain order in your own body, Your Imperial Majesty. Your heart doesn't command your liver, and your liver doesn't command your brain. Each organ has its function, its area of expertise, but they all work together toward common survival." The analogy was simple but profound. Vexithari had always thought of her empire as a vast machine with herself as the central processor, directing every component. But what if it could function more like a living organism, with specialized systems working in coordination? "Show me the specific command structure you're proposing," she said. Chen activated a more complex hologram, displaying an organizational chart unlike anything Vexithari had seen before. Instead of a traditional hierarchy with clear chains of command flowing upward, it showed interconnected networks with authority distributed based on function rather than rank. Strategic planning falls under joint authority between leadership councils from each major civilization, Chen explained. Tactical operations are commanded by whichever species has the most expertise in the specific situation. Resource allocation is handled by economic specialists regardless of their species of origin. Vexithari studied the chart with growing fascination. And disputes between councils? Resolved through a combination of consensus building and rotation of final authority. No single entity has permanent veto power, but major decisions require broad agreement. It was the antithesis of everything Vexithari had been taught about governance, yet she could see the logic in it. No single leader, no matter how capable, could be expert in every area. Distributed authority meant distributed expertise. There's something else I need to understand, Vexithari said. Your technology sharing. The neural network interface you mentioned. If you give that to us, what prevents us from using it against you? Chen's response was immediate and surprising. Nothing. Just as nothing prevents you from using Korthak mining techniques to build weapons against us, or Chitauri navigation skills to outflank our fleets. The casual admission sent a chill through Vexithari's scales. You're not concerned about potential betrayal? Of course we are, Chen replied. But we've learned that the benefits of cooperation far outweigh the risks of betrayal. And more practically, betrayal becomes much more difficult when everyone's survival depends on continued cooperation. The human activated another display, this one showing resource flows and technological dependencies between Federation members. Look at these trade networks. The Korthak provide rare minerals that the Chitauri need for their navigation computers. The Chitauri provide navigation services that allow human agricultural ships to reach Korthak mining colonies. Humans provide medical technology that keeps both species healthy enough to maintain their specializations. Vexithari saw the implications immediately. Interdependence. Exactly. It's much harder to betray someone when betraying them also hurts you, and it's much easier to trust someone when their success directly benefits your own people. The concept was revolutionary for Vexithari. Her empire had always been built on independence, on ensuring that the central worlds could survive without the periphery. But that also meant the periphery had no real investment in the empire's success. Admiral Chen, she said slowly, if I agree to this confederation, what role would I personally play? It was the question that had been burning in her mind since the original proposal. For 3 centuries, her identity had been inseparable from her role as absolute sovereign. Who would she be in a system where authority was shared? That would depend on what you want to contribute, Chen replied. Your experience in large-scale organization is unmatched in this galaxy. Your strategic mind has held together an empire spanning light years for centuries. Those skills would be invaluable in coordinating galactic defense. Chen paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. But I should be honest with you, Your Imperial Majesty. The role wouldn't be the same as ruling an empire. You'd be working with peers, not subjects. Your decisions would be questioned, debated, sometimes overruled. You'd need to convince rather than command. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Terrifying because it meant giving up the absolute control she had wielded for centuries. Exhilarating because it meant no longer bearing the absolute responsibility for everything that went wrong. And the neural network interface technology, she asked, would be freely shared along with all other relevant technologies. In return, we'd expect the same from Zephyrian research. Chen hesitated. There is one condition, though. Vexithari's scale shifted to an alert orange. Which is? The technology requires a specific mindset to operate safely. It's designed for cooperation, for shared consciousness and distributed decision-making. Users who try to employ it for dominance over others experience severe neural feedback. It literally fights against authoritarian impulses. The implication was clear. Using the technology would require Vexithari to fundamentally change how she thought about power and authority. It would force her to embrace cooperation, not just as a political strategy, but as a mental necessity. You're asking me to rewire my own consciousness, she said. I'm offering you the chance to experience what cooperation feels like from the inside, Chen corrected. Many of our leaders were initially skeptical, but once they experienced genuine neural linking with other species, Once they felt the rush of accessing dozens of different perspectives simultaneously, most found it addictive. Chen's expression became more personal. Your Imperial Majesty, I've linked minds with Korthak strategists, Chitauri navigators, even the hegemony's artificial intelligences. The experience of thinking with that much diversity, that much combined intelligence, is unlike anything you can imagine as a single consciousness. Vexathari found herself genuinely curious about the experience. For 3 centuries, she had been isolated by her power, forced to make decisions alone at the top of a vast hierarchy. The idea of sharing that burden, of accessing other minds to help solve problems, was seductive. But it also meant giving up the one thing that had defined her existence for longer than most civilizations had existed. If I agree to this, she said finally, there's no going back, is there? Once the Confederation is established, once our technologies are integrated, the old empire ceases to exist. Chen nodded solemnly. That's correct. But Your Imperial Majesty, something much stronger would take its place, something that could actually survive the coming storm. Vexathari looked around her throne room, at the symbols of 3 centuries of absolute power. Then she looked at the holographic displays showing the approaching threat from beyond the galaxy, the enemy that could render all of that power meaningless. I need one final guarantee, she said. If this confederation is established, if we face these devourers together, I want assurance that my people's culture and identity will be preserved. We may be changing our government, but we are still Zephyrians. That's not just guaranteed, it's essential, Chen replied immediately. Cultural diversity is one of the Federation's greatest strengths. We need Zephyrian perspectives, Zephyrian knowledge, Zephyrian ways of thinking. Homogenization would weaken us all. The human leaned forward slightly. 3 days later, Queen Vexathari stood in a chamber she had never expected to enter. The integration facility aboard the human flagship Aurora's Dawn. The room was unlike anything in Zephyrian architecture, with walls that seemed to shift between transparency and opacity depending on the viewing angle, and surfaces that felt simultaneously solid and yielding to the touch. At the center of the chamber sat 2 devices that would change the course of galactic history. The first was her own Nexus core, carefully transported from her throne room and modified with human neural interface technology. The second was a quantum communication array that would link her consciousness not just to her own empire, but to the minds of leaders throughout the growing Confederation. Admiral Chen stood beside a bank of monitoring equipment, her expression mixing professional confidence with personal concern. Your Imperial Majesty, once we activate the modified Nexus core, you'll experience consciousness on a scale no individual has ever achieved before. Are you prepared for that? Vexathari studied the hybrid device with 4 eyes that had seen 3 centuries of galactic politics. The crystalline core of Zephyrian technology now pulsed with veins of human neural interface material, creating patterns of light that seemed almost alive. I've ruled 17 galaxies from a single throne room, she replied. I think I can handle expanded consciousness. But as she approached the interface chair, doubt crept through her mind. This wasn't just about expanding her awareness. This was about fundamentally changing what it meant to be her. For 300 years, her thoughts had been her own, her decisions made in isolation. Now she was about to join a network of minds that would challenge, support, and sometimes override her judgment. The process is reversible, Chen said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. If you find the experience too overwhelming, we can disconnect you at any time. Vexathari settled into the interface chair, feeling sensors adjust automatically to accommodate her unique physiology. Admiral, in 3 centuries of rule, I've never chosen the easy path when the right path was available. I won't start now. The activation began gradually. First came awareness of the ship around her, every system and corridor mapped in her mind as clearly as the rooms of her own palace. Then the sensation expanded to include the entire fleet. Hundreds of vessels from dozens of different species, each one contributing its unique perspective to her growing consciousness. But it was when the galactic network came online that Vexathari truly understood what she had agreed to. Suddenly, she was experiencing existence through thousands of different sensory systems. She felt the gravitational currents around neutron stars through hegemony sensors, tasted the chemical composition of distant nebulae through Chitauri navigation nodes, and perceived quantum fluctuations through human scientific instruments she couldn't even name. More importantly, She was thinking with minds vastly different from her own. Korthak strategic planning that approached problems through geological timescales. Chitauri pattern recognition that could track relationships across vast networks of information. Human intuitive leaps that connected seemingly unrelated concepts in ways that defied logic, but somehow produced solutions. Overwhelming, she gasped, her physical voice sounding strange after experiencing communication through direct mental contact. But even as she spoke, adaptive algorithms in the neural interface began filtering and organizing the input streams. The chaos of multi-species consciousness gradually resolved into something manageable, even exhilarating. Better? Chen asked. Remarkable, Vexthari replied and meant it. I can feel the entire Confederation as if it were my own body, but each part maintains its distinct identity. Through the network, she could sense approval from dozens of different minds. Not the fearful deference she was used to from her subjects, but genuine respect from equals who understood the magnitude of what she was attempting. Then she felt something else, a disturbance at the edge of networked awareness, like a shadow falling across starlight. The perimeter sensors, she said, her voice suddenly tense. Something's wrong. Chen's expression shifted to professional alertness. What are you detecting? Vexthari's consciousness raced along the network's sensor arrays, tracking anomalous readings at the galactic rim. What she found there sent a chill through her entire being. They're here, she whispered. The Devourers. 3 scout vessels approaching the Helix Nebula region. Through the network, she felt the immediate mobilization of Confederation forces. Fleet commanders across multiple sectors received orders simultaneously. Coordinated through the neural interface with a speed and precision impossible through conventional communication channels. But more than that, she felt the minds of her new allies turning to her for strategic guidance. They weren't just requesting orders. They were offering to blend their tactical expertise with her strategic experience. Your Imperial Majesty, came a mental voice she recognized as General Thuknar, the Korthak who had once rebelled against her rule. My forces are in position to engage, but your experience with large-scale coordination could optimize our formation. The request was phrased with respect, but delivered as a practical necessity. Thuknar needed her expertise, but he was also offering his own knowledge of ground-based defensive systems. Vexithari found herself simultaneously accessing Korthak tactical databases, Chitauri navigation analyses, and human weapons research as she formulated a response. The experience was like thinking with a vastly expanded brain, each component contributing its specialized knowledge to a unified strategic plan. Deploy defense platforms in a 3-dimensional grid around the approach vector, she replied through the network. But don't try to stop them. Let them through to the prepared ambush zone. The plan that emerged from their collective thinking was unlike anything Vexithari could have conceived alone. It incorporated hegemony predictive algorithms to anticipate devourer movement patterns, Chitauri spatial intuition to identify optimal ambush positions, and human innovative thinking to adapt conventional weapons for use against unconventional enemies. Through the network's sensors, she watched the plan unfold in real time. Confederation forces appeared to withdraw from the Devourer's approach, creating what looked like a clear path to the inhabited systems beyond. But the retreat was carefully orchestrated, drawing the enemy scouts into a region of space, saturated with hidden weapons platforms and sensor arrays. When the trap was sprung, the results exceeded even Vexithari's expanded expectations. The coordinated assault didn't just damage the Devourer scouts. It provided crucial intelligence about their capabilities and weaknesses. They're vulnerable to quantum disruption at specific frequencies, she announced to the network, processing data from the engagement in real time, but only when their energy absorption is saturated by simultaneous multi-vector attacks. The information raced through the Confederation's research networks, spawning dozens of new weapon development projects within minutes. But even as she celebrated the tactical victory, Vexithari realized something profound had happened. She had just commanded forces from multiple species in their first successful engagement against an existential threat, and she had done so not as an absolute ruler issuing orders to subjects, but as one expert mind contributing to a collective intelligence. Admiral Chen, she said, withdrawing slightly from the network to speak aloud. I understand now why you were confident this confederation would work. Chen smiled. It's not just about the technology, is it? No, Vexithari replied, her voice filled with wonder. It's about experiencing what it means to truly cooperate. When every mind contributes its best capabilities, when every perspective is valued and integrated, the result is intelligence on a scale that transcends any individual. Through the network, she felt agreement from hundreds of different consciousness across the Confederation. More than agreement, she felt something she had never experienced in 3 centuries of absolute rule: belonging. For the first time in her long life, Queen Vexthari was not alone with the weight of impossible decisions. She was part of something larger than herself, something that could face challenges that would have overwhelmed any single ruler or empire. "The main Devourer force will arrive within months," she said, already beginning to formulate defensive strategies with her new collective intelligence. "But when they do, they'll face something they've never encountered before." "What's that?" Chen asked. Vexithari's 4 eyes glowed with an inner light that reflected her expanded consciousness. Unity that transcends species, cooperation that transcends competition, and intelligence that transcends any individual mind. They may have consumed entire galaxies, but they've never faced a galaxy that learned to think as one. 6 months after the first Devourer scouts had been defeated, the main invasion force arrived at the edge of the galaxy, like a wave of living darkness. Through the Confederation's vast sensor network, Vexithari watched in horror as reality itself seemed to bend and twist around the approaching entities. There were hundreds of them, each one the size of a small moon, their surfaces shifting between dimensions in ways that hurt to perceive even through filtered sensors. They moved through space by consuming the quantum foam that underlied existence itself, leaving trails of absolute nothingness in their wake. "Estimated time to core systems?" she asked through the neural network, her consciousness simultaneously coordinating defensive preparations across 17 galaxies. 43 days, came the response from Admiral Chen, whose mind felt as familiar as her own after months of neural linking. "But that assumes they maintain current velocity. If they accelerate by feeding on stellar material?" The implication hung in the collective consciousness like a toxic cloud. The Devourers could reach inhabited systems in weeks rather than months if they chose to consume stars along their path. Through the network, Vexithari felt the determination of millions of minds preparing for what might be the final battle for galactic survival. Korthak engineers worked alongside human scientists to construct weapons that existed only in theoretical physics. Chitauri navigators mapped escape routes through dimensions that barely touched normal space. Hegemony artificial intelligences ran countless battle simulations, searching for strategies that might work against enemies who defied the laws of physics. But it was the smaller moments that moved her most. She felt a human child on a frontier world asking her mother if the monsters would come to their planet. She experienced a Zephyrian poet composing what he believed might be his species' final verses. She shared the emotions of a Korthak grandmother, teaching her youngest descendant the songs of their ancestors. These were the beings she was fighting to protect. Not subjects or resources, but individuals with hopes and fears and dreams worth preserving. "Your Imperial Majesty," came a familiar mental voice. General Thoknar, now serving as Confederation Defense Coordinator, was requesting her attention. "The fortress worlds are reporting ready status. Phase 1 defensive preparations are complete." Vexthari shifted her consciousness to examine the defensive network they had constructed. It was a monument to cooperative engineering that spanned multiple star systems. Fortress worlds bristled with weapons that combined the best technology from dozens of species. Artificial intelligences that merged human intuition with hegemony. Computational power monitored every approach vector. Hidden fleets waited in dimensional pockets accessible only through Chitauri navigation techniques. Most importantly, every defensive position was linked through the neural network, allowing for coordination on a scale that no single species could have achieved. "Phase 2? She inquired. "Ready for implementation on your order," Thoknar replied. Phase 2 was the desperate gambit they hoped wouldn't be necessary. If the conventional defenses failed, they would attempt something that had never been tried before, using the neural network itself as a weapon. The theory was elegant in its audacity. The Devourers consumed matter, energy, and even quantum foam, but they had never encountered a coordinated consciousness spanning multiple galaxies. If every linked mind in the Confederation focused their mental energy simultaneously, they might be able to create a psychic disruption powerful enough to affect beings that existed partially outside normal, space-time. It was also likely to kill every networked consciousness in the galaxy. Contact, announced a sensor operator whose species Vexathari couldn't identify through the network. Devourer Vanguard entering the outer defensive perimeter. Through millions of sensors, Vexathari watched the battle begin. The first wave of attacks came from hidden weapons platforms that fired quantum disruption pulses, calibrated to the frequencies they had discovered during the scout engagement. The weapons worked, but not well enough. Each devourer that was destroyed released energy patterns that seemed to strengthen the others. They're learning, she realized with growing alarm. Each loss is teaching them how to resist our weapons. The Confederation's adaptive strategies kicked in immediately. Weapon frequencies shifted randomly to prevent the devourers from developing consistent defenses. Attack patterns changed continuously to avoid predictability. But for every adaptation the defenders made, the devourers seemed to counter with improvements of their own. Through the network, Vexathari felt the first fortress world fall. Not destroyed, but simply ceasing to exist as the devourers consumed the quantum substrate that allowed matter to exist in that region of space. Billions of beings vanished not into death, but into a state that had no name because it had never existed before. Second and third fortress lines are collapsing, reported Admiral Chen, her mental voice tight with controlled desperation. Conventional resistance is failing faster than projected. Vexathari felt the weight of decision pressing down on her expanded consciousness. The time had come to attempt Phase 2, to risk everything on a strategy that might save the galaxy or destroy everyone left to defend it. But before she could give the order, something unexpected happened. A new presence entered the neural network, vast and ancient and utterly alien. It felt like the collective consciousness of an entire galaxy, but one that existed in dimensions the Confederation's sensors couldn't detect. We are the ancients. The presence communicated through concepts rather than words. We have watched the devourers consume 17 galaxies while we debated whether to intervene. Through this new connection, Vexathari glimpsed beings of pure consciousness who had transcended physical existence eons ago. They had been observing the current crisis from dimensional spaces that the devourers couldn't reach, waiting to see if the younger species could find a solution that the ancients themselves had never discovered. Your neural network, the ancient presence continued, represents something we never achieved. Cooperation across species barriers, unity without uniformity, strength through diversity rather than dominance. Images flooded the network showing the ancients' own history. They had faced the devourers millions of years ago and had survived only by abandoning physical existence entirely, retreating to higher dimensions where they could observe but not act. We offer our knowledge, the ancients said. Combined with your cooperation, it may be enough. What followed was the most complex technological integration in galactic history. Ancient understanding of dimensional physics merged with Confederation engineering capabilities. Weapons that existed across multiple realities took shape in manufacturing centers, protected by hegemony computational barriers. Defense strategies that incorporated probability manipulation were implemented through human intuitive leaps, guided by Chitauri pattern recognition. But more than the technology, the ancients brought perspective. They showed the Confederation how to perceive the devourers not as unstoppable forces of destruction, but as a natural phenomenon that could be redirected rather than destroyed. They consume because consumption is their nature, Vexathari realized as ancient knowledge merged with her own strategic thinking. But consumption requires something to consume. If we can create an alternative food source, the solution that emerged from their collective intelligence was breathtaking in its elegance. Instead of fighting the devourers directly, they would offer them something better to consume. Artificial quantum foam that contained more energy than normal spacetime, but which existed in pocket dimensions where it couldn't threaten inhabited systems. The implementation required every capability the Confederation possessed. Hegemony artificial intelligences calculated the quantum mechanics. Human engineers solved the practical construction problems. Korthak miners extracted exotic materials from dimensional interfaces. Chitauri navigators plotted delivery routes through spaces that existed between realities, and Vexathari coordinated it all, her consciousness spanning the entire galactic network as she guided the most complex cooperative effort in known history. The final phase of the operation took place in the space between galaxies. where artificial feeding grounds were established in carefully isolated dimensional pockets. The Devourers offered this new and richer food source, began to redirect their consumption away from inhabited space. It wasn't a perfect solution. Some Devourers continued to threaten inhabited systems and had to be fought with conventional weapons. Others discovered how to breach the dimensional barriers and had to be contained through ancient technologies that pushed the limits of Confederation capabilities. But it worked. As the immediate crisis passed, Vexthari found herself reflecting on the magnitude of what had been accomplished. 6 months ago, she had ruled an empire through fear and overwhelming force. Now she was part of a galactic confederation that had achieved something unprecedented. Victory through cooperation over an enemy that pure force could never have defeated. "Admiral Chen," she said, withdrawing partially from the network to speak aloud in the command center that had become her new home. "I owe you an apology." Chen looked surprised. "For what, Your Imperial Majesty?"